On this side of my bench, we have got two of the rarest woods in the world that most woodworkers, let alone people, will never see in their lives. But we're going to work our way up to that, working through South America, Asia, Australia, and begin with this, which I believe is one of the most overrated woods in woodworking. Purple heart. So this is one of the first exotic woods that most woodworkers will buy because it is bright purple. How Mother Nature is able to produce this, I don't know, but I very much appreciate it. But yeah, people will buy this because of its colour. And then that's about as far as it goes, because then the reality sets in where you realise, oh, actually, I don't want a bright purple table in the middle of my room, or I don't want a bright purple box on my mantelpiece. It's just a bit much. Over time, it will kind of darken and become more of a dull browny kind of colour. It's not very exciting to look at even then either. And the working properties of it can be quite challenging. Very interlocky grain, which means it tears out easily when you work it with hand tools. Can somewhat be chippy when you work it with machine tools. I don't find it to be that bad for turning. We make marking knives and plain screwdrivers from this stuff, not out of choice, but more because of the demand for it. People will use this stuff for instruments and things, maybe bits of inlay or jewellery and little bits like that. But when you buy it, just consider the fact that you might not actually want something this colour in your home. But that's purple heart. The next one, Zebrano, otherwise known as Microbilinia brazavicensis. Yeah, I had a lot of requests in the last video I did talking about the best woods for woodworking, asking if I could mention the Latin name for some of these woods so people could find them easier and figure out the translations. So I'm going to give you what you wished for and absolutely butcher some of these Latin names. But this one is Zebrano. It's native to Central and West Africa. It's got these beautiful stripes going down it, which I absolutely love. Can be very difficult to work with hand tools, again, as with most of these woods, because of the interlocky grain on it. But once it is finished and smooth and everything, I can't deny that this is such a lovely wood. And it's actually pretty easy to find as well. It's got a decent hardness on it. It makes really nice furniture and ornaments and is okay for turning as well. We have had a fair bit of tear out with it in the past, but it's not too bad, to be honest, no worse than purple heart. And as far as exotics go, entry-level exotics, zebra wood is a really nice one, or Zebrano, I should say. It's an interchangeable name for them. This is a really nice one to start with, and I would say is a much better start than something like this purple heart. Next to that, we've got this, which is Bubinga, otherwise known as, oh blimey, Guibortia de Mustaz. Oh wait, that's lots of different ones. Now this board of Bubinga is more of a through-sawn board, which means we're not seeing as many of the stripes going up the grain as we are on this Zebrano. That's just because of the orientation of the cut rather than the wood itself. Bubinga does have a somewhat wavy grain, but it can be a lot straighter than this. Once again, it can be somewhat interlocky. Down the side of this board where I put it over the planer, it has ended up tearing out in certain places, and even when sanded smooth it can still have somewhat of a coarse finish texture to it. But I quite like Bubinga. Again, it won't stay this red throughout its entire lifetime. It will turn more of a dull browny colour. But the nice thing about Bubinga versus something like Purple Heart turning brown is that Purple Heart doesn't have a very pronounced grain in it, and so when it turns brown it's just brown, whereas this, you can see we've got these black streaks going through it and wavy grain and everything. That still comes through when this stuff ages, and I think is a pretty nice colour. Bubinga also comes in a number of forms. One of the most stunning, in my opinion, is what's called waterfall Bubinga, which makes the most amazing dining tables, which also comes at an incredible cost. In veneer form, you can also get a somewhat similar effect where it's rotary peeled, which is often sold under the name Kevasingo Bubinga. I think it's the same species, I'm not 100% sure on that, but Kevasingo is what it's called, and that is Bubinga. So it's a lovely red wood, as is this one here, which is Padauk, otherwise known as Pterocarpus soyoxi. That's African Padauk, by the way. African Bidoof is this lovely deep red color. It makes amazing tables, it makes amazing instruments. It's also somewhat light as far as exotics go because it's quite a open porous grain. But once again, you should be aware that this stuff does not stay red forever. It will eventually turn that dull brown color, that Bidoof will, and in fact they will look pretty damn similar once they've got to that stage, because again, there's not very pronounced grain in Bidoof. But as far as working properties goes, Bidoof isn't too bad to work with, either with hand tools or machine tools. Doesn't seem to tear out that much. The softness is okay to work with, but it can be very dusty when you work with it, and also has this very strong peppery smell to it when you're turning it or sanding it or whatever. But it's used for musical instruments and things. One use case I really like for Bidoof is using it on the insides of boxes for linings and things, because UV light can't access it as easily that way, and so it will stay red for a much longer time, if not indefinitely, as long as you keep that lid shut. And it also can be, well, imagine opening a box and seeing a bright red wood like this. It's pretty stunning. So Bidoof, as far as exotics goes, is really nice, and this is probably one of the most vibrant redwoods in woodworking. You don't really get much more red than this. But there is a close contender, one that often gets confused for Bidoof, which is this bloodwood, otherwise known as Brosimum rubescens. Interesting fact, Brosimum, assuming that's how you say it, is from the same species or genus as one of the more rare woods that we'll be talking about later, which is snakewood. This is apparently from that same thing, but we'll get to that in a minute. Bloodwood differs from Bidoof both in its color, in that it's more of a how would you say that, orangey kind of color, rather than Bidoof, which is more of a deep red crimson color, but also in density. Bloodwood is very hard, whereas Bidoof, it's a bit softer. So the working properties of both can be very different. I've only worked with bloodwood a handful of times, and in that time I found it to be quite brittle and hard on chisels. Can sometimes be quite tear-outy, as you'd expect with any of these exotics. But if you're wanting something that has a tighter grain on it, something that isn't going to get quite as dirty as something like Bidoof or Bubinga, which have much more open grains, this bloodwood, having that closed grain on it, can be quite nice for that. Not to mention you'll get a much smoother finish from it once it's sanded and finished. And by the way, if you want to know a little bit more about what things like open grain and closed grain means, and maybe you're wanting a bit more advice on what woods you should choose for woodworking projects, the last video I did, which is linked up here, basically goes into that detail with more easily accessible timbers rather than novelties like we've got here. This video is sponsored by EcoFlow and their Stream Series solar plant. Previously, we managed to install 4 solar panels and 2 batteries, all within the space of a day. But how well is it performing? Well, we're generating solar power. Even though we've seen a couple of weeks of cloudy weather, the system is already beginning to pay for itself. But we can take it further. EcoFlow has sent us their Stream Ultra X, and we thought it would be the perfect opportunity to show how easy it is to expand their battery system and why it's so useful to have extra capacity. But what is the Ultra X? Well, it's essentially an Ultra and a Pro in one compact unit. It's able to take the solar panel inputs like the Ultra, it stores double the capacity of the Ultra, and outputs up to 2,300 watts of AC power, equivalent to both the Ultra and the Pro connected together. But that's not all. We can actually power machines and charge batteries by using the plug sockets on the back of the units. We can even use the app to keep an eye on power levels and power draw. Now, while the system is already saving us money, there's something about using solar energy to directly power our tools that just seems to tick all of the boxes. Even on the cloudiest day, we generated enough power to charge a 4 amp hour battery from flat to full over 15 times. Then on the sunniest autumn day, we could have charged it 86 times over, with any surplus energy getting stored and distributed when needed. Once again, EcoFlow are backing up their products with a 10-year warranty, so even after the unit has paid for itself, it'll still be covered. You can't stay fairer than that. Thanks again to EcoFlow for sponsoring this video. And so bloodwood is sourced from northern South America, kind of like Brazil, Guyana kind of area, whereas Bubinga and Bidoof are African exotic woods. We have one more red wood here, which is from the Australia region, which is this, Jarrah. In my last video, a lot of people were asking about Jarrah because understandably we've got a lot of Australians in the audience who watches this channel, and many of the woods I mentioned in that past video were not easily accessible for you guys. This is maybe not quite as highly figured and as stunning as this little strip I've got here, but Jarrah is a somewhat common wood in Australia, but not so common when you get outside of that. We do see it occasionally, but generally only with specialist suppliers. So I'm actually making a box from Jarrah at the moment, this exact piece, and it's looking absolutely stunning. I found it to be very brittle and very hard, and because this is so rippled as well, it's tearing out quite badly, but it's nothing that can be or can't be cleaned up with hand tools. So it's used quite often for smaller pieces like furniture and boxes and things, but it is also used for larger structural applications as well. So that's Jarrah. I don't really have much more to say about it other than that because of my limited experience with it. But if any of you have more in-depth knowledge or applications or uses for any of these woods, drop it in the comments below, and so other people can benefit from that knowledge. I'm just here to show what's out there. So the next wood we're going to be looking at is this, which is Bocote, which is a Cordia allegnoid. Yes, Bocote. I've used this quite a lot for tool making over the years, and let me tell you now, it is horrible to sand. It's incredibly oily and waxy, and you basically take a few strokes with sandpaper and it is instantly clogged. So as far as consumables go, when I'm working with this stuff, the cost of sandpaper can be through the roof because it is just absolutely horrible. But in terms of its looks, I mean, I think it looks incredible. It has this kind of static TV look, especially when you start looking towards the center of the board where you start seeing the crown cut patterns come through. Not so much on the quarter sawn stuff, although that does look pretty awesome as well. But yeah, it's a shame for such a stunning looking wood that it is so damn horrible to work, or finish, I should say. When you do sand it though, it does have this, how do I just, almost like a pickle aroma to it. It's very distinct and quite strong, and I assume that's all of the waxes and oils in it basically becoming airborne. But it's native to places like Mexico and Central South America. It's used for all sorts, whether that's instruments, I think gun stocks as well, ornaments, furniture, all kinds of things. But just know that when you work with it, you will go through a lot of sandpaper, and it's not particularly easy to work with hand tools either. So that's Bocote, really cool wood. One close relative to that is this, which is Xerocote. Now I never quite know if I'm saying that right, if it's Xerocote and Bocote or Bocote and Xerocote. That might just depend on who you talk to, but I call it Xerocote because it just sounds a bit more elaborate. And this is from the Cordia dodecandra thing. And the easiest way to sum up Xerocote is that it's got this incredible, what is often referred to as spider webbing grain. I have got no idea how the tree manages to grow like this and cause all of these streaky lines, because the idea of growth rings, like you normally see in most woods, whether it's, you know, just your oaks or your zebranos and things, you know, just that normal straight grain pattern that you often see. You don't get that with Xerocote. It just does this mad thing, and when you get wide boards of it where you can really see that extrapolate over a big area, it's mental. I really like it. It's an amazing wood. It's very dense, not quite as oily as its close relative Bocote, and once again we make marking knives and plane screwdrivers and stuff from this, and they look incredible. I mean, you just get it for this spider webbing grain. It's mental stuff. So I'm going to need to stand up for this next one, because it's heavy and spiky. This one is what's called Mallee Burr, otherwise known as Eucalyptus oleosa. And this is basically a growth that happens on the side of a red mallee tree. I'm not sure they actually know what causes burrs to form, whether it's insect or fungal or actual physical damage to the tree. But it's basically a growth that causes this crazy deformed wood grain, and you just get an incredible pattern. Doesn't just happen with this wood, it happens quite commonly with walnuts, it can happen with oaks, elm is a really nice one. You see it quite often in wood turning supplies and things, generally in much smaller burrs, like kind of head shaped, but this was a outlier and I had to get it. Now I can't say I've actually done anything with this or worked with it because I haven't found the right use for something as beautiful as this, but I'm thinking some sort of panel on maybe a box lid, potentially with some profiling or pillowing to it or something. I'm not 100% sure, but there's also some really cool sapwood inclusions on the outside as well, where you get a really strong contrast from it. So that's Mallee Burr, really cool one, waiting to find the opportunity to use it. I'll happily take any suggestions below. But yeah, that is a really nice one. Oh, and it's from Australia as well. Much like the next wood we're going to be looking at, which is Gidgee. And this is Acacia cambage? Not sure, but it's an acacia tree, and it's probably among one of my favorite woods, not native woods. It's very common in Australia, and what I really like about it is that, well, this is basically a board of what's called ringed Gidgee, and that basically means, you know, that curly pattern that you see on curly maple, or rippled pattern that you see on ash or sycamore. I referenced that in the last video. When that happens on Gidgee, we call it a different name, which is ringed Gidgee, and that's what this is. Again, incredibly hard, incredibly dense. One of my favorite tool manufacturers, H&T Gordon, who are from Australia, make handles for their spoke shaves and planes and things out of this wood. And it's actually very commonly used for tool making, so knife scales as well. We've made limited runs of marking knives from it. It's just great for tool making because it is so hard, and also it has very minimal movement once it's completely dried. But whether or not the Gidgee that you buy or find has this ringed figure on it, or even if it's just a plain board, it's a brilliant wood to work with, and I'd highly recommend just giving it a go if you happen to come across any. So that's really nice for its figure, as is this, which is Massa Birch. So I've used Massa Birch a number of times over the years and had some amazing looking boards and logs over that time. We actually did a video on slicing up, I actually think it was this log. What I really like about Massa Birch is when we cut it up into smaller sections for tools, such as our screwdrivers and knives, you're always exposing new areas of the grain rather than just use a big board of it and only see sort of one face of the board. When you cut it into smaller sections, you get a much larger yield from the board and you get more objects out of it, obviously. But when it's turned and you get full 360-degree viewing of an entire object rather than just one face of it, it just looks absolutely amazing. And it's from the sort of Scandinavian regions, whether that's Finland or even Russia. And I should say that Massa Birch, or specifically the word massa, speaks to this kind of figuring that happens to a normal birch tree. Generally that's a downy birch or a silver birch. I'm not completely sure what causes this effect, but there are suppliers who specialize in growing and harvesting this wood, and so clearly they've figured it out. But when we use this stuff, we tend to go through the process of stabilizing it. So we submerge it in a stabilizing resin, bake it, then start turning it just to give it a bit more structural integrity, particularly for the applications we're using it for. But lovely stuff, lovely stuff if you can find it, and there's a lot of variations in the boards as well. So we've sort of reached the halfway point on the workbench now, and we've covered a lot of woods that are exotics, yet they're also not particularly rare. As we move on to this side, however, we're going to be talking about woods that get exponentially rarer and rarer as we move on. And I wanted to preface this next bit of the video with this. I am not glorifying the use of any of the woods on this table. I'm simply here to show you what some of the most amazing woods are that Mother Nature has been able to produce. However, at the same time, by not glorifying them, I am also facing a bit of a paradox in the sense that I use them and I love and appreciate a lot of these woods. And I've been thinking a lot the past few days on how I can best summarize this into some sort of moral guidelines to best advise you. Because my personal guidelines are, You know, I use a lot of these woods to make some of our woodworking tools, whether that's marking knives, screwdrivers, or mallets. And I know that the person buying those tools from me really appreciates the wood that they're using because they're a woodworker. It's not wasted on them. Also, if I took like this board of ebony, for example, that's probably about 100 marking knives I would get from that, as opposed to just using it for a single box and then only one person appreciates it rather than 100 people. So that tends to be how I think about my use of some of these woods. I know that I've got very big yield from them. I know that I've got very minimal wastage from them. And I know that the people who use them will appreciate it and will happily pay the price tag that reflects the price of the wood that they're using. Now, in terms of advising other people, not everyone makes woodworking tools for woodworkers. Not everyone makes small things that gets maximum yield from a board. And this is how I would best summarize it, or best advise you as a woodworker. If you're a beginner woodworker, I don't want to be a gatekeeper on this, by the way, but if you're a beginner woodworker, I would strongly advise against using any of these woods to begin with, for two reasons. The first one is, a lot of these grains are horrible to work with. You need high angle tools, you need to be really good at sharpening and setting up all of your tools. God knows how you're going to work with this thing with basic tools, given the fact it's literally like stone. As a beginner woodworker, you're going to really struggle with that. And the risk is, firstly, it's just going to put you off woodworking and you're really going to struggle. But perhaps more related to the topic on hand, you might potentially waste some of these precious and potentially rare woods. So my advice to you as a woodworker rather than a tool maker is only work with these woods when you know that you are a proficient woodworker and you know that you can handle some of these more difficult grains. And as a step beyond that, if you're making something for someone, whether that be a gift or a commission, make sure they really appreciate the material that they've actually got. Don't just give them Macassar ebony because it's really expensive and really rare when they wouldn't know the difference between pine stained black, okay? That's how I tend to go about it, and that's my own moral guidelines. Of course, the best guidelines I can give is just don't use it, but at the very least, work with suppliers who you know you can trust and you know have come from trustworthy sources, rather than someone who's just gone along to a forest, chopped down a tree without any sort of following any of the guidelines and local laws and international restrictions on the import and export of some of these woods. You got to be careful. We work with trusted suppliers, but it's really easy, really easy to find dodgy ones. So yeah, I don't know if that came out right or if it was a bit gatekeepery, but that's how I would best sum it up. Only work with them if you know what you're doing. Only give them to someone if they can really appreciate it. And if you can, try and get maximum yield out of every board and try to minimize the wastage where you can. Let's move on. So we're going to kick off this next section with desert ironwood, otherwise known as Olnea tessita, that one. And this is, well, this wood and basically this next group of woods are what we'll define as semi-rare. And what I mean by that is quite often they will be, there'll be restrictions on the harvest of the woods. Perhaps the harvesting is restricted to deadfall only. And what I mean by that is the tree has to have come down through natural causes for it to be justified to harvest the wood from it. That's the case with this desert ironwood, which grows in the desert regions of the USA. And it's actually protected as a tree by the local authorities, I guess. Now, desert ironwood, those two words basically describe what it is. It grows in the desert and it is like iron. I shouldn't have done that. That's intrusive thoughts. Ow. It's so damn hard. I want to say the janker hardness was around about 3,500 pounds of force, which is a unit of measurement I referenced in the last video, which is basically how much pounds of force it takes to bury a ball bearing halfway into the wood. The hardest wood in that list, I think, was maple, which was 1,500-ish pounds of force, or maybe that was yew, I'm not sure. This is 2 to 3 times that. It's heavy, dense stuff. It doesn't float in water. And we've used small sections of this to make marking knives in the past. I tend to try and get maximum yield from this where I can, because it's just an amazing wood. It takes a really nice finish once it's sanded, but it can also be quite stinky. It reminds me of going into like old antique stores and getting that horrible old musty damp smell. I don't know if that's limited to this board of desert ironwood or if that's across the board, but it's very distinct when I work with it. But lovely, lovely stuff, but quite hard to find in decent sized sections because it is limited to deadfall. But yeah, desert ironwood. Moving on to the next one, which is basically the African equivalent of desert ironwood. The only reason I'm making a parallel between the two is this one is desert ironwood, this one is leadwood. From the species Combretum imberbe. I'm not going to hit this one on my head because it's got sharp corners, but it is very heavy, very dense, and the word leadwood very much describes, well, this wood. But we use this to make mallet heads from. Once again, this is restricted to deadfall. Our supplier of this stuff sources it from Mozambique, but our supplier did say to me once that in future decades it will be quite hard to find this wood because, well, once the deadfall's gone, it's gone. And yeah, it will start probably beginning to appear on some of the lists of internationally restricted woods. But for the time being, it's okay because we are just working with wood that's already there. So yeah, it's used for small parts, whether that's wood turning or tool handles or carving, all sorts of uses for this wood. It's lovely stuff. It can case harden sometimes. We have to deal with splits and things on it every now and then. But yeah, really nice. Leadwood. So that's our two, I guess I'll define them as metal-like woods covered, ironwood and leadwood. Next, we're going to take a bit of a tangent and start moving on to Australian Tasmanian woods, starting with this, which is tiger myrtle. Wait, let me butcher it. Nothofagus cunninghami. And this is basically just a myrtle tree, but with this black claw-like figure go down it, which isn't a common attribute of myrtle wood. In fact, this is what gives it the name tiger myrtle. So I actually bought this when I was out in Australia a few years ago from a local supplier who was selling this and some of the other woods that we'll talk about in a minute. And I think they said it's not commonly known what causes this tiger pattern on it, but I haven't even used it yet. This is the section that I bought and I haven't quite found the right use for it yet. I'm just waiting to use it for the right thing because I don't want to waste it. It's such a beautiful wood, and that's what I've got to say about it really. I saw it back there and I thought, oh, I have to talk about it even though I haven't used it. Next one, hewn pine. Now this, I think, is probably the only softwood in this grouping, at least by attributes, I guess, because it's not soft. It's still a pretty hard wood, but it is still a pine tree. Now what's special about this hewn pine, otherwise known as Lagerostrobus frankelini, is that this wood is once again restricted to deadfall only. It is a protected wood, and interestingly, this wood, I don't know about this particular board, but it is quite commonly from ancient forests. What I mean by that is it fell down hundreds, if not thousands of years ago in what I think was the Huon River, and they've only somewhat recently began going in to dive and get some of this wood back out for use. You can tell how old and how dense this stuff is because the grain on it, the growth rings are probably about 1 millimeter wide. So yeah, incredibly tight grain, but also somewhat light. Carves really nicely. I actually made a bunch of spoons for my van out of this stuff because I could sort of trust that given how old this stuff is and how well it's been submerged in rivers for however many hundreds and thousands of years, it could probably survive a little bit of soup every now and then. So yeah, really nice stuff. It does have a somewhat distinct smell to it. It's piney, but it's not like normal pine. Yeah, really nice stuff, but not particularly easy to find, particularly in any parts of the world other than Australia and Tasmania and, you know, that kind of area. That's hewn pine. Very interesting stuff. I only learnt about it when I was in Australia, and yeah, I'm sort of treasuring this piece. I want to find the right use for it. Moving on, this. It's been hiding behind me the whole time because it's so big and I didn't want to cut it down into samples. This is Wandoo. Can you guess what part of the world that's from? Of course it's Australia. So this is a Wandoo tree, specifically bird's eye Wandoo. So you know bird's eye maple, it's maple with those little bird's eye figurines in it. This is basically the same effect that's happening to this Wandoo. This bird's eye figure is somewhat uncommon, but the wood itself, once again, incredibly hard and dense, as is the case with most Australian woods. And it can also be, the tree itself can actually live to be very, very old, like a few 100 years old, and survive just fine. It's also got a really cool bark going up the side as well. So I've used little bits of this here and there, used it for box making and things, and you know, specialist places where it's really going to be appreciated. Bird's eye Wandoo, I'll keep that behind me for you to look at. So next we're going to move on to this, which a lot of people may have heard of before, Cocobolo. This is actually one of the first pieces of Cocobolo I ever purchased. It's actually a fretboard blank for guitars and things, but I wanted to make a small box from it at the time, but sort of decided against that and have now kept it to find a slightly better use for it. Just haven't found that yet. But Cocobolo is a beautiful exotic wood. Has these deep red crimson patterns on it, really, really strong streaky patterns going across the board. The downside to Cocobolo is that it's what we call a sensitizer, I think. I haven't butchered the name yet. It's a Dalbergia retusa. Dalbergia, by the way, is the rosewood species as a whole. We'll get into a few more rosewoods later on because we're going to be touching on a lot of Dalbergias, but just know that Dalbergia means rosewood. Rosewood is not a particular tree as such, it's actually more of a, you know, it's a group of trees, and this is part of that rosewood group, but it's called Cocobolo. Anyway, this is a sensitizer, and what I mean by that is as time goes on, you can start developing an allergy or a reaction to working with this stuff, particularly the dust that comes off of it. You can start getting rashes and dermatitis and stuff from it. It's just something that builds on over time and may or may not happen to you. I'm fully prepared at some point in the future to not be able to work with this stuff unless I come in basically wearing a hazmat suit. But in the meantime, it is probably, in terms of the tools that we produce, it's probably among the best looking one across the board consistently. Other woods, you get variations here and there. Like sometimes it's a bit figured, sometimes it's very figured. Cocobolo is a consistent crowd pleaser. When you work with it, very strong peppery smell. And yeah, this stuff is sort of found in Central South America again. It is on and off restriction lists as far as import and export goes. A few years ago now, it was put on a temporary ban, I think for about a year or so, where we weren't able to ship this stuff out of the UK or back into the UK, but it's now since off that list. But yeah, there was a big ruckus a few years ago, particularly with instrument suppliers who make things out of this. But anyway, that is Cocobolo, very nice wood. Next we're going to move on to ebony. Now, much like rosewood, ebony is a catch-all term. There's actually more specific ones that we can reference. I've actually got three here. And if we start with this Gabon ebony, which is Diospyros cassiflora. Diospyros is the ebony kind of catch-all name. Gabon ebony is, of all of the ebonies, probably the most consistently dark black one. The rest of them tend to have streaks and things going through them, whereas Gabon ebony does have light lines here and there throughout it, but it is more consistently black. When they say that piano keys were made from ebony and ivory, this is the ebony they were talking about. Can be somewhat difficult to work with, can tear out and things. It can have quite a blunting effect on tools given how hard it is. And perhaps part of the reason this wood is so prized and scarce is not just because of the select parts of the world that it grows in, but also the tree itself is not all this color. In fact, this is just the central part of the tree. The rest of it could be completely white. Sometimes you end up buying black and white ebony, which I'm not sure is a Gabon ebony or like a variant of that. But sometimes the white part of ebony is actually a feature as well. It's just sold as white ebony, or sometimes black and white ebony creatively, or what's the other one? Pale moon ebony. I've had some of that over the years and it's wonderful stuff. But yeah, the truly black stuff can be quite difficult to get in decent sizes. And once again, it can be quite susceptible to splitting and drying uncontrollably if you're not sort of conscious of the board that you're working with. So that's Gabon ebony. This is Macassar ebony. And once again, like the Cocobolo that I mentioned earlier, this is a fretboard blank that I purchased with the hopes of making it for a box, and then just kind of second guess myself, and I'm thinking of something else to use it for now. And this is a Diospyros celebica. So again, Diospyros ebony. But this one, however, is not from Africa, like the Gabon ebony. This one is actually from Indonesia or Southeast Asia. Now, I would say that Macassar ebony is probably the one that you see being used a bit more often in high-end furniture and things, particularly as a veneer, because as far as ebonies go, if you compare the two of these next to each other, this Macassar ebony has a bit more of a prominent grain on it and more of a stripy, it's just a bit more of a nicer pattern on it. Whereas this, it's just black. And actually, if you finish it in lacquers and things, by the time you've got that shiny black finish on it and things, it just looks like plastic. Whereas this, even if you were to go for a high gloss finish, it still has that wood-like effect on it. But yeah, you'll see it used for veneers quite often, and that's probably one of the most sensible ways of using Macassar ebony, because veneers, you get such a massive yield from it. But yeah, it's really nice. However, we don't actually tend to use it for marking knives and things. We did a limited run of Macassar ebony marking knives a few years ago, but what we found is that when you're turning small objects from Macassar, you don't really... What you need is the full context of the board in order to see that stripy pattern. When you make small things from it, you don't really capture all of that beauty in such a small object, and so you might as well just use normal Gabon ebony. So that's one thing to consider when you're making things, small objects from Macassar ebony or any of these highly figured woods. Think about, am I actually going to get the, that amazing effect over such a small area, or is it actually better reserved for something a bit bigger where you get the full context of that amazing grain? So one thing to think about with Macassar ebony. That is not the case, however, with this next one, which is Mun ebony or Moon ebony. I've sort of heard it being referred to as both. Now, this section is actually the end grain of a board. So if we look at this, the grain is going up on this Gabon ebony. This is basically a slice taken off there. So this is an entirely end grain section, but what that's given is this amazing swirly spider webbing pattern that we saw in the Zero Coty earlier. This is almost like a mixture of Zero Coty and Macassar ebony. In terms of the name to butcher, this is, I didn't actually see that before, Diospyros Mun. Moon. And this is found in the sort of Vietnam area, and it does have restrictions on the import and export of it, and generally you'll only be able to find smaller sections like this. I have seen bigger ones, but they can be quite difficult to come by. But the reason I purchased this is because at some point I want to make a kitchen knife handle from it, basically turn it into knife scales, because, well, that's what this was sized for, and yeah, it'll just look mental. A ebony kitchen knife handle. It's good stuff. You know what I mentioned earlier about making sure you appreciate the woods that you work with? If I'm making it for myself, you can be damn sure that it's being appreciated. I've got a bog oak kitchen knife that I made a video of a few years ago, and every time I use it, I look at it and it's like, I love you. Probably in one of my top 3 favourite possessions, I think. Speaking of which, we will move on to bog oak, and this also signifies the next kind of level of rarity we're going to be talking about, which is, well, rare woods. These are woods that can be broadly classed as collector grade woods. Maybe there is heavy import and export restrictions on them. Bog oak, however, is a bit of an outlier in that. I'm just grouping it in this in the sense that this wood, we can't grow bog oak. I kind of touched on this in the last video, but this piece of wood here is probably about 5,000 years old, maybe even older than that, which basically makes it as old as the pyramids. This is a oak tree, just a normal oak tree, that fell over thousands of years ago into a peat bog, got submerged, had a reaction with all of the peat and the tannins and everything, turned it this black color through natural causes. Then someone plowed a field, brought it up to the surface, looked at it and thought, oh, this might be worth looking into, rather than burning it, which is what some people do, not realizing that the cost of one of these logs is their retirement. And so, you know, there's so many things that go into whether or not we are actually able to get bog oak. So I'm putting it in this rare list, even though it's not necessarily a restricted species. It's just a very special wood and we should treasure it. But I talked about that in the last video. I just wanted to have it here because I forgot to use this sample in the last video. Whew, I'm getting carried away here. I honestly think this topic is just long overdue for me. I get so excited when I see all of this laid out, like, ooh, look at all this stuff. So we're going to kick off this section of high rarity woods with this, which is Indian rosewood. This one is Dalbergia latifolia, and it's from, as the name would suggest, India, Indonesia kind of area. This stuff, incredibly hard and incredibly dense, a nightmare to work with, an absolute nightmare to work with. A few years ago, I made an Indian rosewood toolbox from this stuff, again following the kind of moral compass that I have, in the sense that if someone buys this, I know that because it's a toolbox, they're a woodworker, they're going to appreciate it, and I can confirm the person that purchased it is a woodworker and very much appreciates what they've got. I actually built it to have this beautiful sapwood line going all the way around the box and then across the lid as well, and then it had a tiger wood tray on the inside as well, which isn't as rare of a wood but contrasted it really nicely. But cutting the dovetails for that toolbox, nightmare. You would take, you'd get the chisel to be razor sharp, you'd take 3 chops and you would have a flat edge on the end of that chisel. It was so long-winded trying to cut that joinery, and looked amazing when it was done, but it would be a push to get me to do that again. But beyond that, I did find that it actually planed quite nicely. When you buy instruments and they have a rosewood fretboard on them, that rosewood, as a broad term, is quite often Indian rosewood. This is actually the perfect thickness for us to slice knife blanks out of, and so we get really good yields from these boards. I actually purchased this as old stock from an old tutor of mine at the college I used to study at. It was basically decades old stock. He didn't really have a use for it, and so gave me first refusal on it, and I bought the lot. So yeah, Indian rosewood, very, very nice. Moving on, Brazilian tulip wood. Now, this made a special appearance in the last video I did because we were talking about poplar and how that is sometimes called tulip wood. And then I brought up the fact that no, this is deserving of the name tulip wood, not poplar. Let's just call poplar poplar and tulip wood tulip wood. This is Brazilian tulip wood, otherwise known as Dalbergia decipularis. And it is defined by this, well, I mean, look at it. It's often called like a candy stripe grain pattern. This is probably among one of my favorite woods to make small marking knives from because of just how vibrant it is when it's turned, but also you still get a nice grain pattern on it. You know, unlike the Padauk that we mentioned earlier, which is, you know, more of a red, solid red color, this one, at least you get a really cool grain pattern going through it. It's actually quite similar to the Cocobolo, not in color, but the streakiness you get from it. You get the vibrancy of the color and the streakiness of the grain. So yeah, it takes a really, really nice polish. Smells quite nice when you work with it, which is a commonality across a lot of the Dalbergia woods. And this was used quite frequently historically for inlays and things. If you go to a museum and you look at the old brown furniture that's there, you might see tulip wood mentioned every now and then as well, because yeah, it was used for inlays and marquetries and things. But this is a particularly special bit in the sense that I've been able to get half a log of it. So we can get really good yield from this. And actually, this is a really good point for me to mention this. When we're processing these woods into usable stock for us to make tools from, any small offcuts that we get, we are now selling them on our website, because we know that small sections that might not be useful to us might actually be useful to someone else who just makes jewelry or who wants to use this stuff for inlay. So we're making even the smallest bits available for you to purchase. So next we will move on to Kingwood. This one I think is Mexican Kingwood. By the way that wood is quite often identified is not just from the visual aspects of it, because there is so much variation in wood, you know, in the color and the grain structure and everything. It's quite often done so through the end grain and the pore structure of it. Kingwood is defined by, well, it's a Dalbergia species, once again, a rosewood, and it is the Dalbergia congestiflora, and it actually kind of looks a bit like cocobolo in some ways. The reason I say that is, again, you've got a really strong, vibrant pattern going all the way through it, yet you've still got that strong, streaky pattern from the wood grain as well. Actually looks quite similar to this tulip wood as well. So yeah, this is a really nice wood, and when I've taken sections from this to make marking knives from in the past, I've got one bit here that I can still use. I've actually tried to slice it down the sapwood line, so you get a nice two-tone effect when you look at the marking knife. You've got sort of sapwood and then the dark purple pattern on the other side. But yeah, that's Kingwood. Next, pink ivory, otherwise known as, oh blimey, Philogeton zaheri. Yeah, that one. We should be clear here that pink ivory, it is a tree. It's not ivory in the sense of a horn or a tusk or anything. It is a tree. I'm assuming it's called pink ivory just because it's, well, because of the region, sort of Africa, that's where this stuff's sourced from, as is ivory. And also, it's got a very consistent grain going all the way through it with not a lot of grain patterns. So I presume that's what ivory looks like as well. And this is just a pink variation of it. Anyway, a lot of guesswork there. What I do know is that this was traditionally put aside for Zulu royalty in Africa, and quite hard to come by, at least in big sections of it. So again, this is used for things like, you know, jewelry, small turned objects, inlay, but not really used for bigger things because it can be quite difficult to find the material. And, you know, if we flash all the way back to this purple heart as well, do we really want vibrant pink things floating around our house in the form of tables and chairs and stuff? I mean, wow, that would be expensive if you were to make it from this stuff, but also, is it good for that purpose, or is it better for just small ornamental things or things that like are accents here and there? That's how I would best use pink ivory, or how I would think about using this, because it is expensive. It's obviously a rare wood, and I think in bigger sections as well, it's probably going to be quite splitty perhaps, and also difficult to work with. Well, it's almost certainly going to be difficult to work with hand tools because it's so damn heavy and dense, like a lot of these woods. Now that brings us into this next one, which is snakewood, otherwise known as Brosimum guineensis. I'm just butchering that one. Interestingly, we mentioned that Brosinum species thingy earlier when we were talking about bloodwood. Bloodwood and snakewood are from the same thing. Snakewood, however, is, as you'd expect from the name, it has this incredible snake-like pattern on it, and this is all I have left of an entire log that I've been slowly getting through the past few years in the form of knife blanks and screwdrivers and all that. Snakewood can be quite an expensive wood for many reasons, the main one being the trees are very small in diameter, probably like the diameter of my head maybe, not including the hair. It's sort of like that big, and the center of the tree can often be completely hollow, which means you've only got this ring of actual usable wood going up the length of the tree, and even then it might not have that snake-like figure going up it. It can just be sort of plain brown dense wood that doesn't look anything special. But yeah, it's very heavy and very dense, and I found it to be quite nice to turn, to be honest, although it can be somewhat brittle at times. The thing that snakewood does do though, which is a real shame, is that it can split very easily. So not only have you got to contest with hollow trunks and areas of low figure and things, but you've also got to work around splits with the wood. So it's very difficult to get decent usable sections like this. And it's why, once again, I like using it for things like marking knives, because I can be quite confident that by the time I get a small blank this big out of it, I can avoid most of those kind of splits and actually get something usable out of it. So that's snakewood. Next, we will talk about this, which is lignum vitae, otherwise known as Guaiacum officinale. Oh wow, that sounds very official. I didn't read that before. Lignum vitae, interestingly, is Latin for what I believe is tree of life. And the reason it's called that is because in the past it used to be imported into Europe for its medical properties. However, since then it has been, well, it's sort of heavily endangered. It's got a lot of import and export restrictions on it. And it's quite hard to come by decent sections of this stuff. In fact, this might not even be genuine lignum vitae. Quite often there's an alternative of it called Argentinian lignum vitae, which is similar in a lot of ways, but it's not the genuine stuff. So I think this might be Argentinian, but I'm fine with that because it still shares a lot of those characteristics. It's incredibly hard and dense and also oily. Nightmare to glue this stuff because of how it resists glue. Also clogs up your sandpaper, has very interlocky grain. It actually used to be used for ship bearings because of the hardness and those self-lubricating properties. But you know, we were talking about janker hardness earlier, how much pressure it takes to bury a ball bearing halfway into this wood. I think the highest on this list so far was desert ironwood, which sits around 3,500 or so. I'll put the correct figure below. Lignum vitae, let me just get the correct one here, 4,390 pounds of force to bury a ball bearing into this. It's hard, very hard stuff. Fortunately, that was a lighter hit. Yeah, so that's lignum vitae, really cool wood. And we're going to wrap up this section of rare woods before moving on to the two ultra rare ones, or mythic grade, I should say, with this small section I've got here, which was actually on the border of whether I was going to include it in this one or the next section. The reason it's not is because this is currently on the CITES Appendix 2, which means that you can still import and export the wood, but you need to have very heavy documentation, and yeah, it just needs to be properly documented from start to finish, much like a lot of these woods, to be honest. Like tulip wood and rosewoods and things are all on that CITES Appendix 2. And I should say that CITES is the, well, what is it? The Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species. And what that means is they are basically the governing regulatory body that dictates what species can be imported and exported and the controls that needs to happen on each of them. It's not just limited to trees, it's also the same for plants and animal species as well, and they tend to do it through this tiered system. So these are the people that dictate when a species needs to have certain controls put on it in order to protect its survival, I guess. And this is also why Cocobolo was temporarily put on a control list a few years ago before being taken back off it. This wood is on the border of that. It's called Bois de Rose, otherwise known as Dalbergia maritima. Bois de Rose basically translates to rosewood. So of all of the rosewoods, this is, well, it's the rosest of rosewoods, I guess. I'm sort of struggling for words on how to best sum this up. This is obviously a pen blank from the stuff, but what you can't see is that this is actually 3 strips that I've glued together into a pen blank, because this section was slightly bigger a few years ago, and I sliced a few knife blanks out of it. I think I sold one of them, I've kept one of them for myself, but then I didn't want to just throw the offcuts in the bin, so I glued them together into a pen blank like this, and we'll probably make another marking knife from the bits that I salvaged. But this stuff, when you fresh turn it, it looks incredible. It's this, the best way to describe it is it looks like Darth Maul. It's this black, deep red color, smells incredibly rose-like, more so than any of the other rosewoods. The only downside is that that red figure doesn't stay. Eventually it does darken into this more sort of dark maroony, almost black color where you can't really see it. That's why I've kept one of the marking knives for myself, because I know what's underneath that and I know how beautiful it actually is underneath that dark layer of oxidization, I guess. Yeah, Bois de Rose. It's from Madagascar, by the way. But yeah, very, very heavily restricted, but not on the list of these two remaining woods. I'm starting to lose my voice now. These two remaining woods are the ones that I alluded to at the start of the video and is what we will refer to as mythic rareness, okay? So, I'm going to sit down for this. We're going to kick things off with this, which is Brazilian rosewood, otherwise known as Dalbergia nigra. What makes this stuff so rare is the fact that many decades ago, much like Cuban mahogany, which is something I mentioned in the last video, this was used very heavily for all sorts of things because it was so nice to work with, its hard-wearing properties, and the fact that just visually it looks absolutely stunning. This piece is pretty plain looking because it's like perfectly quarter sawn. However, this wood can exhibit the spider webbing pattern that Ziricote, the wood that I previously mentioned, has, but not so much in this section. So it's used very heavily, and as a result, it's now found itself on the CITES Appendix 1 list. Now, just to put that into perspective, CITES has put a restriction on Dalbergias, which is rosewoods, as a whole, and it's put them on CITES Appendix 2. CITES Appendix 2 basically relates to woods that are, well, materials that are woods in their raw form. So whether that's a log, whether it's a board, whether it's a billet, pen blank, maybe even veneer. CITES Appendix 2 means that the wood, when it's in that form, has been restricted for international trade, so you can't buy a board of it very easily, or yada yada yada. Brazilian rosewood has found itself on CITES Appendix 1, which means that not only can you not import this wood in its raw wood form, like this, but you also cannot import or export anything made from this wood either, whether it's made from it in its entirety or whether it includes Brazilian rosewood in the finished piece. So there's horror stories of people like traveling bands and stuff flying internationally to do a gig and not knowing that their guitar has a Brazilian rosewood fretboard and having it seized at customs. I don't know how often it's caught, because whether there's someone at customs testing all the guitar fretboards or whatever, but that's the extent in which this stuff can be or is restricted. It's on CITES Appendix 1. This stuff I personally identified and then had it verified by a source here in the UK who is very, very proficient at identifying rosewoods. So I identified it, sent it off, had it confirmed, and this is a genuine piece of Brazilian rosewood that I have been very slowly going throughout the years. We did a small number of marking knives from it, but once again, we could only sell these within the UK. We're not allowed to export them internationally because it's a finished object. It's very cool owning it though. I feel very grateful. So that's Brazilian rosewood. This final one is not as widely known as Brazilian rosewood because Brazilian rosewood, it went through the whole thing like Cuban mahogany, where it was used a lot for furniture and things, and at least out in the West. It was very prized, and there's all sorts of things made from it. So this stuff is called Zetan, otherwise known as Pterocarpus santalinus. And this is, well, it's on the CITES Appendix 2 list, which means it's not as heavily regulated as Brazilian rosewood, the wood that I mentioned earlier. However, this is quite often used in China to make sort of traditional Chinese imperial style furniture. The issue is that this tree was harvested to complete eradication, apparently, around the sort of Ming dynasty in China. And it's got to the point now where in order to make this furniture, they have to import it from India, where it also grows. The issue with that is that it's on the CITES Appendix 2 list. But certain suppliers, smugglers and poachers don't care about that, and they are literally willing to bear arms in order to get some of this stuff. And the fact that I've got some of it now is quite surreal, actually. I will say that it took a little bit of figuring out on my part to find out what it actually was, because I got this from a supplier for free, but they didn't actually know what it was, apparently. And then because they didn't know what it was, they just gave it to me because I had quite a big order of stuff at the time, and we're just like, one of our Chinese suppliers gave this to me as like a cool little gift. Here you go, you can have it. So he gave it to me. I did a bit of research and I'm sort of 95% sure it's Zetan. I have used this to make 4 chopsticks. I basically sliced it up because, you know, chopsticks about that kind of length. This was a sort of rectangle section of it. I sliced off that face, sliced that into 4, and just got perfect yield from it for 4 chopsticks. And they look amazing. They've taken a really nice polish and they're holding up amazingly even when being dipped into hot ramen. So yeah, I've had a really good sort of use from one section of this wood until now, and then I've kept this to maybe make another 4 from, because it's really nice having that really high yield from such a precious wood and be able to use it as a sort of physical item rather than just something that is sat there being appreciated. Chopsticks was actually a really cool use for this, and I'm thinking I might use that for this remaining section as well. So that's Zetan, and that is Brazilian rosewood, 2 of the scarcest woods on the planet, and here they are in my workshop, being appreciated every day. I'm such a freak. There we go. In case you couldn't tell, my voice is being lost. I was going to do some elaborate outro for this, but I feel like I haven't got it in me. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching it. Please bear in mind everything I was saying earlier about using these woods responsibly. Just know that when you're about to use these woods, you need to be proficient at woodworking as a whole. You need to know how to use sharp tools and how to set up the tools and everything. Don't go jumping into stuff like this just because it looks pretty, because you'll probably not enjoy it, you'll probably ruin the wood, and you might end up creating unnecessary wastage. Use them responsibly, use trustworthy suppliers, and when you do use it, appreciate this gift that Mother Nature has given us. She didn't need to do this, but she did. And so as woodworkers, we are the first line in people who should appreciate this lovely array of materials we've got. Whew. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.